So when people make artefacts, they are effectively hitting two rocks together. And when you do that, if you do that successfully, hopefully one of your rocks will break and the other will not, the other being your hammerstone. And when you do that process, it's a little bit, the best way to really understand it is imagine a marble or a steel ball bearing hitting a windscreen. And when it does that, which hopefully isn't going to happen to your car, it creates a few very diagnostic features, and that's what we are looking for. So we are going to train the AI to identify those particular features. So they are the features that when we hit two rocks together, it results in a certain type of fracture, and that's really what we are looking for as archaeologists.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora, koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and today I'm talking to Dr. Rebecca Phillipps, a Senior Lecturer in Anthropology, and someone who's leading a world-first project which is going to use AI to quickly and accurately identify the difference between human-modified stone artefacts, Māori ones, and ones that have been created naturally. Morena, Rebecca.
Morena.
Lovely to have you on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really interested to know how this project came about because it's a pretty big breakthrough for us internationally, isn't it, in terms of the work we're doing here and that you're doing in particular?
Yeah, so it was a very typically New Zealand story of how this research group came together, and it was sort of colleagues' daughter dates other colleagues' son, and then very serendipitously start talking about research ideas, and then another person on our research team kind of had the spontaneous idea that maybe we could do something as crazy as train an AI to identify artefacts, and if we could do that successfully, it would greatly speed up the process of identifying but also analysing those artefacts. So yeah, it was a very, almost a chance happening that we all came together. We had our first meeting, everybody was really excited about the idea, and we just went from there.
And who does it involve in the university? Because it's not just archaeology, is it? It's a whole lot of people who are all using their expertise on this.
That's right. We certainly couldn't do it alone in archaeology, so it's really requiring the expertise of colleagues in bioengineering, so Paul Nelson and his team, and also colleagues in e-research, so Mark Gargan and his team coming together. But we also have colleagues from Otago Museum and the University of Otago who are working with us, archaeologists who are based down there, who are working with us, sharing their collections as part of this process as well.
And what problem will it solve? Because for people who don't know much about stone artefacts, why are they so fabulously important? What is it about them that makes them special and a taonga and something that we need to preserve and know about?
So stone artefacts are globally significant for the majority of our human history. So our primate ancestors used stone artefacts, and in fact primates today still use stone tools to perform some tasks. But the great thing about them, in addition to their very long history of relationship with our species, is that they survive incredibly well. So because they're made out of stone, they don't degrade into the ground as organic artefacts might do. So they preserve really well, and people use them a lot in the past. So that it means that today we have a lot of them to hand to look at, and that really lets us see something about what people did in the past. And that's true of Aotearoa New Zealand as well. Lots of people use lots of stone artefacts in the past. They weren't the only tools that they used, but they certainly make up a good proportion of those tools, and they've survived, preserved really well into the present. And the other exciting thing for us is that throughout the history of New Zealand archaeology, people have been going out and excavating, collecting from different archaeological sites. So we have really good collections of these stone artefacts in museums and in storage facilities around the country. So it's a very ready resource that we can make use of, and it's one that hasn't really been made use of in the past.
And are they all just sitting there waiting to be classified, or have they already been classified as man-made or natural?
Some have been classified, and I would say because the majority were collected by archaeologists, they in theory, should all have been at least identified as made by humans as opposed to natural rocks. But what tends to happen is when they turn up in museums, people focus on certain types of artifacts. So the really easily recognizable ones, like an adze, or maybe if it's bone, a fish hook, for example. And those tend to be recorded and analysed and put on display potentially. And they're a certain type of artefact that have historically been considered to be more significant. And what we're interested in is everything else. And what's fascinating is that the everything else is actually the majority of the collections that we have. So we might have from an archaeological site maybe 10 adzes, but then we might have 100,000 artefacts that were used in the manufacture of those adzes or used for other types of activities. And it's those sort of unclassified, previously unanalyzed artefacts that we're really interested in.
And do you have any idea how this AI will do it, for those of us who don't know anything about it?
Well, that includes me, because I am an archaeologist. I'm not a computer scientist. But in our pilot study, we used two-dimensional photographs and we trained the AI to distinguish between the different types of photographs, and then we gave it information about those photographs. So myself and another archaeologist went through and we classified all of those photographs into different basic categories, i.e., is it an artefact made by humans? Is it not? And then some other basic categories. And we fed that information in. So we effectively trained the AI to recognize those images. And so the process will work in a similar way, but what we're adding beyond the pilot is actually three-dimensional imaging of these artefacts, of these taonga. And that's where bioengineering come in, because they have a particular expertise in producing very high-resolution 3D images very, very rapidly. So we can, traditionally by taking a series of photographs, doing photogrammetry would take us quite a long time. This almost produces an image instantaneously, at least from our perspective it does. And that's really exciting because it means in addition to being able to identify them, we also get a three-dimensional image of these artefacts. And it means we can also look at other features that might be interesting to us as archaeologists.
In the past, people would have spent time doing this, like a long time. Is it an arduous process to look at thousands of small shards of stone and decide what they are?
It certainly can be, and there is a fair amount of training that goes into it. So when we teach students, it takes quite a long time for them to become proficient in identifying and then analysing these objects. So even if you become very, very good at doing it, it can still take a long time to go through and enter different attributes or take measurements, do that all in a laboratory setting. So this, even with the very best practitioner, that would really speed things up. And I guess the other aspect of that is there are not very many proficient practitioners or archaeologists who can analyse these objects in Aotearoa in particular. For some reason, stone artefacts have been very seldom studied at a high level, particularly in the last sort of 40 or 50 years or so. So there aren't very many people who can do this anyway. So this will really help us kind of cover that deficit.
And the machine can do this really quickly and accurately? That's the point of it?
In theory. And of course, we're in a development stage right now. So, we can produce really good high resolution 3D images. It is a challenge to progress beyond just that image recognition that we did in the pilot. So we are working with e-research with computer scientists to figure out how best to do that and how best to identify particular attributes. Taking measurements is a little bit easier because it's just basic geometry, but moving beyond the pilot is sort of where we're at right now and addressing some of those challenges.
Do you think that this is going to help Māori to know more about themselves? Because it feels like it will, in terms of how they lived in the landscape and what they did in their everyday lives. Yeah,
I think those are questions that archaeologists are obviously always asking, and I think for Māori, they're interested to know those things too. And I think what it will allow us to do is to get more nuance in those narratives, because there's been a tendency in the past to maybe gloss over some of the detail of the story of what our ancestors did in the past. And I think this will allow us to you get more nuance through time, but also more nuance across space. So there's, I think, again, a tendency to gloss over and just say, oh, all Māori did this in the past, when in reality there was probably a lot of different things going on in different parts of the motu. So people, performing different activities and focusing on different things, maybe whether you're in the south or whether you're in the north. And that's really important for Māori and for their understanding of their ancestors. And I think the other thing this project will do is help us understand how people made stone artefacts, how people made objects like adzes. Again, that is a knowledge that maybe hasn't been revitalized like other practices like, say, weaving or carving have been revitalized. So I'm hoping that another sort of additional outcome will be a better understanding of how these objects were made, and maybe, help encourage people to become interested and maybe even take up that themselves and learn how to make stone artefacts.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Mm. And presumably they're not the same type of stone. They're different depending on what part of the motu they come from?
Absolutely, yeah. So when Māori first arrived here from elsewhere in the Pacific, from East Polynesia, they encountered a range of stone resources that's really unlike anywhere else in this part of the world. So there was quite a lot of geological variability. So people would have had an interesting time kind of reacquainting themselves with different types of stone, and they did that very quickly and were very effective at exploiting different stone resources in different ways. So we get a lot of variability. You don't really see that in places like the Cook Islands or French Polynesia. So there were a lot more different stones to choose, and that varies depending on where you are in the country and depending on what kind of activity you're doing as well.
So, for example, Pounamu would be down in the south. Would that be right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's quite interesting. That's a fascinating story in and of itself. I whakapapa to the South Island. So I think that's always a really interesting to see how people adapted to that type of stone. And when you look at the earliest examples of people using it, you can see that they kind of had to figure out like how to make use of what is quite a unique type of stone. Yeah, so that's another interesting story.
Yeah. So what does this mean for archaeology at the University of Auckland and just generally internationally? Is it the kind of thing you can interest other people in around the world? For example, Indigenous Australian communities who might be interested in classifying their own artefacts because they've got such a vast area to do it in, haven't they? And they must have so many.
Definitely. As I said, stone artefacts are globally ubiquitous. They're a really important part of our human history. And places like Australia have the same issues in that there are comparatively few archaeologists who are specialists in this area. And there is a lot of archaeological work that goes on. And much of it in Australia is the result of cultural resource mitigation. So looking at heritage prior to development. Probably people might be familiar with the mining development that has interacted in different ways, some of them very positive, some very negative with heritage. And our colleagues there too are interested in what we are doing. In fact, I had emails almost immediately from colleagues in museums in Australia asking, can we participate in this project? Because we too have these collections that are relatively unknown. They've been seldom studied in the past, and we want to connect our communities with their heritage by learning more about them.
That's fantastic, isn't it? Because there must be thousands of these objects all over the place gathering dust in museum vaults, and are there, I suppose?
There are. So to put it in perspective, one collection that we have at the University of Auckland from our recent fieldwork on Ahuahu Great Mercury Island has 41,000 stone artefacts. Wow. And that's probably the biggest that we know of in Aotearoa, but it's probably not the biggest we know of in Australia. So I have a colleague who recently did a project that had 80,000 stone artefacts, and that's just from one excavation.
That's incredible, isn't it? Mm. And you've been on these digs yourself, obviously,
I have.
And you have found some of these stone artefacts.
I have.
What's the most special thing that you've found, do you think, or is that too hard a question?
People always ask me that as an archaeologist. For me, the the power is really in the numbers. We can learn so much from these great collections. And yes, I found some beautiful taonga from time to time that, would be considered very aesthetically pleasing, put in a museum on display. But to be honest, what really interests me is understanding how these objects were made, how they were used, how they were reused, and how that connects us to the past. I think, being able to work with communities and get them excited about, learning from these really important taonga, and sort of change that narrative, those traditional narratives, is what gets me excited.
So what next on this project? Have you still got some money left from your MB fund?
We do. We're in our second year now, and we're really working on this challenge of how best to train the AI to identify and move beyond what we did in the pilot. So move beyond just distinguishing between a artefact made by a human versus a natural rock, and start learning, training the AI to identify more features and take more measurements. So that's really taking place with our colleagues who are working on that particular work stream. What we've done is we've collated all of our archaeological data. So that's the information that will eventually train the AI. So I mentioned before our work on Ahuahu, Great Mercury Island, and that data set is going to be used as part of that. And then we're also now starting to work with our colleagues in Otago as well and getting them involved and thinking about how we might do that.
What are those features that you're talking about? You mentioned the basic difference between one thing or another, but what are the more nuanced things that you're hoping the AI will identify?
So when people make artefacts, they are effectively hitting two rocks together. And when you do that, if you do that successfully, hopefully one of your rocks will break and the other will not, the other being your hammerstone. And when you do that process, it's a little bit, the best way to really understand it is imagine a marble or a steel ball bearing hitting a windscreen. And when it does that, which hopefully isn't going to happen to your car, it creates a few very diagnostic features, and that's what we are looking for. So we are going to train the AI to identify those particular features. So they are the features that when we hit two rocks together, it results in a certain type of fracture, and that's really what we are looking for as archaeologists. But beyond that, we can also see when somebody has repurposed an artefact. So they might have initially used it to perform one task, let's say preparing flax, cutting flax, and then maybe they've reworked it to do something else, like cutting up meat, for example. Probably wouldn't happen in actuality, but let's say hypothetically that's what happens. People will do things to that stone artefact to modify it to turn it into a different form. So we can again train the AI to identify those features, and that helps us learn about the sort of use life of that artefact. So each artefact's got its own little history in and of itself.
How old are these stone artefacts?
So they date from all periods of our pre-European history. Many of them date to the very earliest arrival of Polynesians in Aotearoa, so sort of 700 years or more ago. But we do have collections that come from all periods in the past, before European arrival. And again, that's a great thing because it gives us the opportunity to understand how their use changed through time.
Thank you for coming to talk to us today. It's been really interesting, and I wish you so well with that project.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.